Her sisters laughed at the poor traveler. They stopped smiling when his royal carriage arrived. Autumn came to Vale House like a creditor who had finally grown tired of patience. It leaned its wet shoulder against the windows, ran cold fingers beneath the doors, and made every fire in the house seem smaller than it had the night before. The lane beyond the gate was a ribbon of black mud. The hedges shivered. The trees stripped themselves without ceremony, as if even the orchard knew that gentleness had become an expense the household could no longer afford. In the front parlor, where a coal fire hissed more than it burned, Lydia Vale held a length of pale rose ribbon beneath her chin and turned her head to admire how prettily it softened the line of her throat. Marianne, younger by a year and given to the kind of laughter that often arrived before thought, sat on the window seat with a fashion plate spread open upon her knees. They discussed sleeves, satin, and the possibility that Mr. Hollis of the neighboring estate might attend the Wilford assembly after all. They spoke eagerly, brightly, and with the peculiar desperation of women who knew a future could collapse for want of a prosperous marriage and preferred not to name the fact aloud. Eleanor Vale sat at the smaller table near the fire, a ledger open before her, the stub of a pencil balanced between two careful fingers. She wore her plainest gray merino dress because it did not show ash, flour, or the fading where a sleeve had been turned once already and might soon need turning again. This high collar brushed her throat. Its long sleeves were neatly buttoned at the wrist. Her chestnut hair was smoothed into a modest knot at the nape of her neck. She had quiet gray eyes that people often called calm when what they really meant was easy to overlook. The firelight never clung to Lydia the way it clung to silks, nor to Marian the way it followed movement. It rested on Eleanor's hands instead, on the hand that kept the account book steady and the hand that kept the household from noticing how near the edge it lived. "You cannot seriously be totaling candle wax again," Lydia said without looking at her. "If economy were a dowry, Eleanor, you would be a great heiress." Marian laughed. "Then perhaps she shall marry a man in love with arithmetic." Eleanor drew a neat line beneath the column and lifted her head. "If I do not total candle wax, Marianne, we shall have no candles in November." "How severe she sounds," Marian said. "One would think the house depended on her entirely." "It was meant lightly. It always was. That did not make it harmless." Eleanor answered only by closing the ledger for a moment and warming her fingers before the fire. Their father had been dead 11 months. Since then the modest gentility of Vale House had revealed the thin boards beneath its polish. Unpaid notes, a tenant cottage roof left unrepaired, dwindling stores in the pantry, a coach sold in spring, and one made fewer every season. Lydia and Marianne understood the danger in flashes and then fled from it into chatter. Eleanor understood it every hour. When the knock came, it was not the tidy rap of a caller but the heavy, uncertain sound of a man who had spent the last mile in rain and no longer had strength for dignity. The butler had been dismissed in June. There was no one to answer save Elsie from the kitchen, whose hands were in bread dough, and so Eleanor rose first. She crossed the dim hall, lifted the latch, and found the storm standing on the step in the shape of a man. His coat was dark with rain. His boots ringed in mud to the ankle, and the brim of his hat sent water in steady lines down one shoulder. He was taller than most men who had entered Vale House, broad through the chest in spite of fatigue, with black hair made almost blue by wet and eyes so dark they seemed to gather the weather into themselves. He wore no jewels, no signet ring, no mark of importance beyond the kind of straight, contained bearing poverty seldom teaches. Even exhausted, he seemed a man who had spent his life obeyed. "Forgive the intrusion," he said. His voice was low and roughened by cold. "My horse threw a shoe half a mile back. I was told there might be shelter here until the groom from Wilford can be fetched. I require very little. A place by the kitchen fire would do." Lydia had come into the hall behind Eleanor, ribbon still in hand. Marian peered over her shoulder. At the sight of the stranger's worn gloves and unadorned cravat, both brightened with the quick, careless amusement of girls relieved that misfortune had chosen somebody else for the evening. "A place by the kitchen fire," Lydia repeated. "How romantic. Have the storms begun delivering heroes to respectable doors now?" Marian covered a smile with her fingers and failed entirely to hide it. "Perhaps he is a poet in disguise." The man's expression did not change, though something sharpened briefly in his gaze. Eleanor felt the shame of their laughter strike her more keenly than if it had been directed at herself. He was wet, cold, and plainly at the edge of endurance. That ought to have been enough. "You may come in," she said. "And if you are made uncomfortable again in this house, it will not be by me." She stepped aside. He entered with the hesitating care of someone accustomed to reading rooms before crossing them. Up close she noticed a small tear at one glove, clotted mud at the hem of his coat, and the tension at the corner of his mouth that suggested pain kept under discipline. He removed his hat. Water darkened the hall tiles. "Elsie can send tea," Eleanor said. "And broth." "Tea for a drenched philosopher," Lydia murmured. This time Eleanor looked directly at her sister. She did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that quiet, used properly, can shame louder people more completely than anger. "Tea for a guest." Pause followed. Lydia lifted her chin. Marian looked away. Neither apologized. The stranger inclined his head. "You are kind, Miss Eleanor Vale," she said, then added because habit required it, "This is my sister Lydia, and this is Marianne." "Rowan Hale," he answered after the smallest beat. "Merely a traveler who misjudged the weather." Merely. The word did not suit him, yet he spoke it as though testing how it sounded. Elsie took his coat to dry while Eleanor led him, not to the kitchen, but to the morning room where the fire had not entirely failed. Lydia and Marianne returned to the parlor, their laughter lower now, embarrassed but not corrected in spirit. Eleanor poured tea herself because the maid was busy and because she disliked letting anyone shiver while social distinctions were being considered. Rowan Hale accepted the cup with a murmured thanks. His hands were strong, scarred lightly across the knuckles, and colder than the porcelain. "Your boot is bleeding," Eleanor said. He glanced down as if the information surprised him. "A scrape. Nothing worth mention." "That does not make it nothing." From the workbasket she kept near the hearth she drew a strip of clean linen. When she knelt to offer it, he rose at once, almost too quickly, as though he could not bear the sight of her at his feet. For the first time something like warmth touched his face. "I can manage," he said. "Then manage with this." It was so nearly a smile that she felt one answer before remembering herself. He took the bandage. While he tended to the cut, she set bread and a little cheese beside the tea. He ate as though he had not meant to be hungry and had lost the argument with his own body. On the small side table lay the household ledger she had carried in from the parlor without thinking. The wind rattled the panes. Rowan's gaze rested on the open page. "You keep accounts?" he asked. "Somebody must. And do they balance?" "They obey, which is not the same thing." That won the faintest real smile. It changed him more than fine clothes could have done. It made him look younger and, for a dangerous instant, less guarded. "You speak as if numbers possess character." "They do. Honest numbers are plain company. False ones flatter before they ruin you." He leaned back in the chair, watching her in a manner she knew too well from no other man because no other man had ever bothered. Most men looked at Lydia first, then at Marianne, and only afterward, if some practical requirement demanded it, at Eleanor. Rowan Hale looked as though he were listening to the part of the evening everybody else had overlooked. A groom was sent for. Time passed in the slow, intimate way it does when rain hems two strangers temporarily inside the same small room. Eleanor learned that he had traveled north, that his horse was named Flint, and that he answered direct questions with the economy of a man practiced in withholding more than facts. He learned, without asking many questions, that Vale House had once been better kept, that the curtains had been turned, that the silver was incomplete, and that Miss Eleanor Vale corrected a servant's arithmetic gently rather than sharply. When Elsie forgot to bring sugar, Eleanor thanked her anyway. When the maid apologized for the broth being thin, Eleanor said thin broth is warmer than no broth and meant it. By the time the groom from Wilford had still not come and the clock had struck 9, Rowan's clothes were dry enough to travel if he must. Outside, however, the lane had become a black river. Elsie swore no sensible man would attempt it. Lydia and Marianne had long since retreated upstairs. Their indifference no longer stung Eleanor as it once would have done. Habit had dulled that edge. What disturbed her instead was how very aware she had become of the man by the fire, of the silence between them, of the way he held his teacup as though born to better porcelain than hers and yet grateful for it all the same. "You should stay the night," she said at last. "We have no grandeur to offer, but the blue chamber is dry, and the roof there does not complain in rain." He looked at her steadily. "Your sisters may object to a nameless traveler under the same roof. My sisters object to many things. The weather has not asked their opinion." Something moved in his face then, something softer and more astonished than amusement. "You are accustomed to being the sensible one here, I think." The truth of it settled between them too plainly. Eleanor turned toward the fire so that her expression need not be witnessed. "I am accustomed to doing what requires doing." He did not answer at once. When he did, his voice had changed. It was quieter. "That is not the same as being seen for it." Her hand tightened on the edge of the chair. No one had said anything so exact to her in years, perhaps ever. She told herself it was coincidence, a lucky guess made by a perceptive stranger. But the words found the hollow place beneath her ribs with such precision that denial became difficult. "You should rest, Mr. Hale," she said. "Rowan," he corrected gently. She nodded once. "Then you should rest, Rowan." When she gathered the empty tray, she noticed his torn glove upon the arm of the chair. Without comment, she took it to the work-basket, turned it inside out, and mended the split with such small, even stitches that the repair nearly disappeared. She laid it back where he would find it in the morning. It was a foolish act, unimportant, and yet it stayed with her after she climbed to her room, after the wind troubled the shutters, after the house went still. Some things did not cease to matter merely because nobody praised them. In the dark, with rain moving over Vale House like a hand searching old wounds, Eleanor thought of the stranger's words. Not the sensible one, not the dutiful one, not the plain one, not even the forgotten one. Seen. It frightened her more than it ought to have done. Morning did not arrive so much as uncover the storm's wreckage. The rain had passed, but the world it left behind looked rinsed of color. The lane shone in rutted silver. Bare branches tapped the window glass with the persistence of questions. Vale House smelled of damp wool, cooling ashes, and bread finally baked. Eleanor went downstairs early, as she always did, and found the morning room empty except for the folded blanket Rowan had used and the repaired glove lying across the chair arm exactly where she had placed it. For one unreasonable moment she felt disappointment, sharp and almost childish. Then she saw through the window a glossy black equipage sweeping through the gate with 4 matched horses, outriders, and panels painted in a deep royal blue so polished they caught the thin sun like water. A crest flashed on the door, a crown above it. Not a theatrical crown for fashion or embroidery, but the official, unmistakable insignia of service near the highest circles of the kingdom. The carriage rolled to a halt before the steps. Lydia, who had come hurrying at the sound of wheels, stopped so abruptly that Marian nearly collided with her. The same mouths that had laughed the night before fell open in perfect symmetry. A liveried footman descended. Another followed. Then the gentleman they had received by the fire stepped out from the shade of the porch where he had evidently been waiting for the carriage's arrival. He no longer wore the soaked, anonymous coat. Someone had brushed and restored his dark blue superfine. His linen was fresh, his boots polished, his bearing impossible to mistake. Whatever exhaustion had blurred him the night before was gone. What remained was command. Lydia went pale, then bright, then pale again. Marian made a sound that might once have been a laugh and now had nowhere to settle. Eleanor, standing half behind them with a basket of mended linens in her arms, felt the world perform one deliberate turn and ask her whether she had expected surprise from it any longer. The footman announced, with the grave projection of a man trained for important thresholds, His Grace Adrian Ashbourne, Duke of Westridge, special envoy to His Royal Highness. Silence fell with almost comic violence. Lydia's hand flew to her throat. Marian stared. Eleanor did neither, partly because shock had gone too deep for display, and partly because the man in question was looking only at her. There was apology in his gaze. Not dramatic apology. Something quieter, more exact. The kind a truthful man offers when he knows explanation may come too late to seem convenient. "Miss Vale," he said, coming up the step, "I owe you thanks, and I owe your household greater clarity than I provided last night." Lydia recovered first because vanity often rallies faster than sense. She sank into a curtsy so elaborate it nearly resembled collapse. Marian followed several seconds late. Eleanor could not have executed either performance at that moment if her safety had required it. She simply inclined her head and said, "Your Grace." His eyes flickered, almost wry. He had been Rowan when rain made rank indecent. He was Adrian Ashbourne now because daylight had returned the machinery of the world. "I traveled without announcement," he said. "By choice. The storm completed what discretion began. I regret the discomfort caused." Lydia found her voice. "Your Grace, had we known." "You might have laughed more softly?" he asked. The rebuke landed so cleanly that Marian flushed scarlet. Lydia's lips parted and closed. Eleanor ought perhaps to have been horrified. Instead she felt a dangerous, involuntary pulse of gratitude. He did not prolong their embarrassment. That, more than the rebuke, told her what sort of authority he possessed. Men secure in power seldom needed to display its whole weight. "I came," he continued, "because I had business nearby and because I have lately grown suspicious of hospitality that appears only when heralded." His gaze returned to Eleanor. Last night answered that suspicion. The basket in her arms felt suddenly heavier. She set it carefully on a chair. "Then I am glad the rain served some use." Something like admiration passed through his expression and was gone. The housekeeper and Eleanor, the accountant, the woman who knew what creditors' boots sounded like on gravel, all returned at once. Royal carriage or not, nothing about Vale House had altered with the morning. The cracked cornice remained cracked. The pantry remained narrow. The letter from Mr. Benthall, the solicitor, still sat unopened because she already knew its contents too well. As if summoned by the thought, there came another knock. This one she recognized instantly. Crisp, legal, practiced. Mr. Benthall himself entered when shown in, carrying hat and leather case and the dry smell of office dust into a room still unsettled by revelation. He bowed to the Duke, startled but sensible enough to hide it, then turned to Eleanor. "Miss Vale, I called regarding the note your late father renewed last year. Payment has not been received. My clients can delay no further. Unless security is produced within the week, the matter proceeds to seizure." Lydia swayed. Marian sat down hard. The Duke did not move, but the whole room altered around his stillness. "What security?" Eleanor asked, though she knew. "The house, the remaining silver, and the lower field at West Acre," Benthall said. "There are also questions regarding your sister's small portions, which cannot be protected absent a settlement." The words struck each object in the room and turned it provisional. The chairs, the curtains, the mantel, the staircase up which their father's footsteps would never sound again. Eleanor kept her face composed only because there was no one else to keep the world from showing its teeth. "Thank you, Mr. Benthall," she said. "I understand." He bowed again and withdrew, relieved, no doubt, to escape before ducal attention found him. For several heartbeats no one spoke. Then Marian whispered, "We are to lose the house." Lydia said nothing. Her earlier laughter had left her with no armor against practical ruin. Adrian looked from one sister to the other, then to Eleanor, who stood perfectly straight in her plain gray dress as if poverty were easier to bear than spectatorship. He had expected distress. He had even, in his more cynical moods, expected performance. What he had not expected when he rode to Vale House in borrowed obscurity was a woman who treated a freezing stranger with dignity before she knew whether he had consequence to reward it. Nor had he expected that the same woman would receive news of catastrophe with the composure of a general taking measure of the battlefield. He had come in disguise because every mother in 3 counties had lately presented him with daughters polished for inspection. Westridge required a duchess, Parliament required him in town. His late father's will required marriage before the year's end if certain trusts were to remain unchallenged. And the Prince Regent required a man who could move through the country without every ambitious household dressing its deception in silk. Old Tom Wren, once groom to Adrian's mother and now settled near Vale, had told him of a house in decline and of the middle daughter who kept it breathing by means of ledgers, mended sleeves, and a temper too quiet to be fashionable. Adrian had not meant to be moved. He had certainly not meant to be known by a woman who had never been introduced to him properly. "Miss Vale," he said, and because he was a man who preferred hard truths to comforting evasions, he spoke the next sentence plainly. "I have a proposal. It will sound abrupt because it is abrupt. I ask you to hear it through." Lydia inhaled as if suddenly remembering she existed. Marian stared harder still. Eleanor's face did not change, though she seemed to grow even stiller. "If you mean charity, Your Grace, I cannot accept it. I mean no charity." His voice was calm. "I require a wife. You require security. I am prepared to offer a marriage settlement sufficient to preserve this house for your sisters, discharge the notes upon it, and provide each of them with a respectable portion. In return, you would become Duchess of Westridge and stand with me publicly before the year turns." The silence that followed no longer belonged to surprise alone. It belonged to danger, to the strange clean edge where lives stop resembling themselves. Lydia made a choking sound. Marian whispered, "Eleanor?" Eleanor looked directly at Adrian. "Why me?" He could have answered with beauty, kindness, convenience, impulse. All would have been partly true and none sufficient. The whole truth was too intimate for a room full of sisters and unpaid debts. So he gave the portion she was entitled to first. "Because you were the only one in this house who did not alter your conduct according to what you believed I could give you." He held her gaze. "And because I think you capable of the office." Office, not romance, not admiration, should have sounded cold. Oddly, it did not. It sounded respectful. Lydia found language at last. "Your Grace, surely this is hasty beyond propriety." "Poverty is hasty beyond propriety," Eleanor said quietly before she could stop herself. Marian began to cry. Lydia turned away. Adrian watched Eleanor as she stood at the center of her family's fear and seemed to draw its sharpest points into herself so the others would bleed less. "You need not answer this instant," he said. "Yes," she replied. Then, more slowly, "No. I will answer soon, but not this instant. If I am to bargain with my life, I should like half an hour in private first." It was the first indication that Miss Eleanor Vale might accept rescue on terms rather than gratitude. Adrian felt, to his own surprise, relief. "You shall have an hour," he said. She inclined her head. "Then I will use it well." Eleanor spent 40 minutes not in tears, as Lydia expected. But in the little schoolroom her father had once promised to refurbish and never had. The map on the wall was peeling at the edges. A cracked slate leaned beside the cold grate. On the table lay the household ledger she had carried there almost without thought, because figures were steadier company than feelings. She sat, open to the page where candle wax and butcher's bills marched in disciplined rows, and let the arithmetic of survival speak first. If she refused, the house would go. Lydia's small store of ribbons and Marianne's music would not prevent seizure. The servants who remained would be dismissed without references a proud family could no longer provide. The lower field would be sold. Their father's failures would be catalogued by strangers. If she accepted, she would marry a man she did not know. A man who had entered her house in mud and left it wrapped in authority. A man who saw too much and explained too little. When she returned to the morning room, Adrian stood by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. Lydia and Marianne had been tactfully removed to the parlor. Their embarrassment and hope could be felt through the walls all the same. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, "if this is to be a bargain, we ought to speak of terms honestly." He turned. It was not quite a smile that touched his face, but it was near enough to one to change the light in the room. "I prefer honesty." "Then mine first. I will not marry you to become an ornament publicly displayed and privately ignored. If you require only a title holder in silk, choose someone else." "Agreed." "You answer very quickly." "Because I had no desire for an ornament before you refused to be one." "Continue." The warmth of color threatened her composure. She refused it. "My sisters remain provided for in writing, not by verbal promise. Vale House stays theirs for life or until either chooses another establishment by marriage. Elsie and the 2 remaining servants stay on through winter with wages paid. The tenants at West Acre are not to be turned out for arrears before Christmas." And if at any time you regret this marriage, you will not punish my family for it." Adrian listened without interruption. When she finished, he crossed to the table, drew a sheet of paper from his case, and began writing in a hand as decisive as his speech. "Anything further?" he asked. It startled her that he did not call the requests impertinent. It startled her more that he seemed almost satisfied by them. "Yes," she said after a moment. "I would like the right to manage my household without being contradicted in front of servants unless I have proved incompetent." He looked up then, and she saw unmistakable amusement. "That is a formidable clause. It is a necessary one. Then yes, you shall have it." "Why?" she asked again, because the question had not gone anywhere in the meantime. Not why Mary. Why me? Not the answer suitable for witnesses. The real one. Something in him closed and opened all at once. He set the pen down carefully. "Because last night you did not ask what a cold man could buy before you gave him shelter. Because your sisters laughed, and you did not. Because you mend what other people assume can be discarded. Because I have had enough of rooms in which every smile begins with calculation. And because when you look at ruin, you do not romanticize it. You start making lists." He paused. "The rest of the reason I cannot yet tell you without sounding either arrogant or absurd. Then tell me when it will sound truthful instead." "I will." It was not a perfect answer. It was, however, an answer offered without ornament. She found she trusted plain speech more than pretty certainty. By noon his solicitor had been summoned from Wilford, along with a special license that moved as swiftly as ducal rank could make the law move. Vale House became a place of signatures, sanded ink, sealed papers, and Lydia's dazed attempts to apologize without having to look directly at last night's cruelty. Marian wept twice, laughed once from nerves, and insisted on pressing Eleanor's plain pearl comb into her hands as if pearls, even modest ones, might stand between a sister and the unknown. The wedding took place the next morning in the village church under a sky the color of unpolished pewter. There were no musicians, no crush of fashionable guests, no long procession of congratulating relatives eager to inspect the bride. Eleanor wore her gray dress because there had been no time to make another, and because she disliked the idea of borrowing finery to disguise what the marriage was. Adrian wore dark blue and a grave expression that made the vicar read the service as though afraid even heaven might delay him if he paused too long. When Eleanor spoke her vows, her voice did not tremble. When Adrian spoke his, something in the church air seemed to steady around the sound of them, as if he had made promises before in public matters and meant to keep this private one with the same severity. Lydia cried in earnest this time. Marian clutched a handkerchief already ruined. Old Tom Wren, invited unexpectedly by Adrian, stood at the back and watched with eyes that had seen more of the Ashbourne family history than most titled guests ever would. Afterward, there was no wedding breakfast worthy of the name. Only tea, a slice of seed cake, and legal documents that placed Eleanor's sisters beyond immediate ruin. Adrian brought the signed settlement to her himself. "Read it," he said. She did. Every clause, every figure, every protective line. Nothing was missing. He had included even West Acres' tenant leniency exactly as she phrased it. She looked up from the page and found him waiting, not for praise, but for verification. "It is as promised," she said. "Then we begin honestly." The carriage prepared for Westridge Hall at 3 o'clock. Lydia embraced Eleanor too tightly, whispering, "I was monstrous," against her shoulder. Marian cried openly and promised to write every week. Eleanor forgave them with less drama than they expected because she had never mistaken their faults for malice alone. They were frightened girls in a world that trained women to compete for rescue and then punished them for the ugliness competition produced. Before she entered the carriage, she looked once more at Vale House. The front steps were worn in the center. The windows needed putty. Ivy had begun to bite at the east wall. It was not a beautiful house by grand standards. It was simply the place where her unnoticed labor had accumulated year after year, like stitches beneath a hem that nobody admired because the cloth held well enough to forget them. Adrian offered his gloved hand. She placed hers in it. His grip was warm, steady, and formal. When the carriage door closed, the sound seemed to divide her life cleanly in two. The road to Westridge ran through bare beaches, low stone walls, and fields silvered by recent rain. For the first mile neither spoke. Eleanor watched villages pass in strips of autumn color and thought how strange it was that her entire future sat opposite her with one boot crossed over the other and a scar at the base of his thumb she had not noticed before. He watched her looking outward and thought how self-contained she seemed, as though she had packed not just clothing and brushes but the whole habit of not asking too much from happiness. At last he said, "You may ask me anything you wish." She turned back to him. "Very well. Why were you traveling alone in a storm if half the county would open its doors to you with lanterns and compliments?" His mouth shifted. "Because lanterns and compliments are often the problem." That is not a full answer. No, but it is a true one. She let that stand for the moment. Then another. "Are you always so certain?" "No. Only when uncertainty would make matters worse for other people." She considered him. "That sounds exhausting." This time he laughed softly, and the carriage seemed less ceremonial for it. It often is. The laugh altered something small between them. Not enough to call warmth. Enough to prevent total cold. Westridge Hall rose out of the late afternoon like a decision somebody wealthy had made in stone generations before anybody living could object. Its windows reflected a pewter sky. The steps spread wide and pale. The columns before the entrance did not invite so much as evaluate. Beyond the house the park rolled away in wet bronze and green, and farther still the dark line of winter woods waited under mist. If Vale House had been a body holding itself upright through economy and pride, Westridge was a kingdom trained never to confess weakness. Even its age looked expensive. The servants gathered in the entrance hall with perfect composure that was almost more intimidating than curiosity. Adrian introduced her formally. Her Grace, the Duchess of Westridge. The title settled on Eleanor like a garment cut from someone else's measurements. Housekeeper, butler, footmen, maids. A cook whose expression suggested she considered any mistress under 40 a temporary inconvenience. They bowed. They curtsied. No one laughed. That should have felt like victory. Instead it felt like a silence waiting to decide what it truly thought. Her apartments were large, elegant, and impersonal in the way of rooms prepared by instruction rather than affection. The bed curtains were ivory silk. The dressing table held crystal bottles that had not been chosen with her in mind. Fires already burned. A maid unpacked her trunk and tried valiantly not to look startled by the simplicity of its contents. Adrian saw her only at dinner. The table in the state dining room was so long that conversation required either raised voices or surrender. Silver stood in glittering ranks. 6 candles on either side produced more ceremony than warmth. Adrian sat at one end, Eleanor at the other, like diplomatic opponents instructed to remain civil. A footman filled glasses. Another changed plates. Every sound seemed sharpened by the distance between them. "Did you travel well?" Adrian asked, as if they had not ridden together for hours. "Yes, Your Grace," she answered, and hated how easily the room had made strangers of them. His eyes lifted. For an instant she thought he hated it too. Then the butler approached with sauce, and the moment passed. This, then, was the cold period of their bargain. Not cruelty, not neglect. Something more difficult to resent because it was so scrupulously proper. He ensured her comfort, summoned dressmakers, assigned a companion if she wished one, offered the use of the library, music room, and gardens when weather allowed. He asked whether she required anything. He did not ask how loneliness altered shape in grand rooms. At night she heard the house settle around her with old wooden sighs and distant footsteps softened by carpet. The scale of it made even sorrow seem diluted. She walked galleries lined with ancestors whose painted faces gave away only rank and bone structure. She learned which corridor led to the family chapel, which stair servants preferred, which windows caught sunrise over the east lawn. She also learned that Westridge had been governed in recent years by habit more than attention. Curtains were perfectly dusted, but the infirmary stores needed inventory. The dairy accounts did not match the deliveries. A widow on the Lower East Farms had applied twice for timber repairs without response. Eleanor noticed because noticing had always been her form of love. On the fourth morning she asked permission to review the household books. The housekeeper, Mrs. Grant, blinked. Her Grace wishes to see accounts? Yes. Personal expenditure. Madam? All of them. By evening she had identified 3 patterns. Waste in the kitchens due to outdated ordering. Duplication in coal allotments to rooms no one used. And a peculiar slackness in estate supply invoices initialed months earlier by Mr. Nathaniel Pritchard, the former acting steward, who had recently left for London to pursue other work according to the notes provided. Nothing criminal could yet be proved. But Eleanor disliked numbers that smiled too readily. Adrian found her in the library after dinner, seated beneath a lamp with columns of figures spread around her like battle lines. Firelight moved over the dark shelves. She wore gray again, because dressmakers needed time and because gray had long ago become less a surrender than a language. It said she would not compete where she did not believe competition honest. Mrs. Grant informed me, he said, that my Duchess is conducting an audit. She looked up without alarm. Your Duchess is trying to discover why unused rooms consume more coal than occupied ones. A surprising thing happened then. He came nearer, not as a husband observing a decorative whim, but as a man drawn toward competence the way other men are drawn toward flirtation. And? He asked. She turned the ledger so he could see. Either the north corridor is inhabited by dragons, or someone has been billing the house twice for delivery. I do not believe in dragons. His mouth moved before he let it. Nor do I, though some of my aunts may have qualified. That almost smile again. It warmed the room more than the fire had managed. You see, she said quietly, the numbers flatter before they ruin you. He studied her for a long moment. I remember, there were many ways a man could make a woman feel visible. Compliments were the laziest. Attention was rarer. Memory rarer still. Eleanor lowered her gaze back to the page only because holding his for too long began to feel unsafe. Days acquired a pattern. Formal breakfasts taken separately by long-standing custom. Walks when weather allowed. Correspondence. Estate matters. Dinners at the impossible table. And through it all, small intrusions of something gentler not yet brave enough to name itself. Adrian sent the apothecary when he learned Elsie had a cough back at Vale House. Eleanor ensured his mother's neglected conservatory oranges were saved from overwatering. He noticed. She noticed that he noticed. Neither spoke of the fact directly. The servants changed first. Servants always do. They saw that the new Duchess remembered names, asked after families without patronage, corrected errors privately, and never used grandeur as an excuse for carelessness. By the second week, kitchen waste had fallen. By the third, the widow at East Farms had timber for her roof. By the fourth, the under-housemaid who stammered no longer dreaded carrying trays to the Duchess's sitting room because her Grace never finished her sentences for her. And still the dinners remained cold with distance. One night, after a meal conducted almost entirely through silver and candlelight, Eleanor stood at the end of the emptied table and looked down its polished length. It was absurd. A piece of furniture had conspired with tradition to keep 2 living people half a room apart. She put her hand against its smooth edge and thought of all the ways houses taught hearts to imitate them. In his dressing room across the corridor, Adrian removed his cufflinks and tried not to admit that he dreaded dinner because he wanted too much from it. He had chosen a wife for reasons practical enough to survive scrutiny. Practical reasons were safe. Practical reasons did not wake a man at 2 in the morning wondering what Miss Eleanor Vale had meant when her mouth softened over a joke she had not intended to make. Practical reasons did not make him aware of how lonely his own house had become until another person's quiet changed the sound of its corridors. He had meant to give her security, respect, and freedom from humiliation. He had not expected the deeper danger, admiration. The thaw between them did not begin with declarations. It began with adjacency, with being found repeatedly in the same places for reasons that had started practical and become, by degrees, less so. Westridge had room enough to shelter indifference for generations, yet under Eleanor's direction it began, reluctantly, then sincerely, to prefer nearness. In the days that followed, Westridge began revealing itself to Eleanor not through its grandeur but through its habits. In the still room, where glass jars caught the pale noon like imprisoned weather and the room smelled of rosemary, wax, and clean linen. She set herself to sorting dried lavender, willow bark, and winter syrups into labeled shelves. At first the servants watched her with the caution reserved for new authority, uncertain whether this attention would become interference. Instead they discovered that she listened before she altered anything, and that when she changed a custom she could explain exactly why. "If illness comes in January, it ought not to find us searching in the dark," she said to Mrs. Grant. The sentence went farther through the house than any command would have done, because it made plain that she expected competence rather than displays of fear. Adrian came upon her there one afternoon and paused without announcing himself, simply observing the ease with which she made order seem less like discipline than mercy. He realized that she thought of preparedness as a form of tenderness. Nothing dramatic occurred. "No question. No bow." Yet when she finished and turned, she found him still there, his expression thoughtful and unguarded in a way she was beginning to understand as rare. He took the empty basket from her hands without being asked, and she let him. In the days that followed, Westridge began revealing itself to Eleanor not through its grandeur but through its habits. In the dairy passage, where cold stone kept the air sharp and the copper pails shone dully under narrow windows, she set herself to reworking the butter and milk tallies so deliveries matched actual use. At first the servants watched her with the caution reserved for new authority, uncertain whether this attention would become interference. Instead they discovered that she listened before she altered anything, and that when she changed a custom she could explain exactly why. "Waste is only invisible until winter names it," she told the steward's clerk. Not unkindly but with finality, the sentence went farther through the house than any command would have done, because it made plain that she expected competence rather than displays of fear. Adrian came upon her there one afternoon and paused without announcing himself, simply observing the ease with which she made order seem less like discipline than mercy. He had been raised among people who called such things small. He was beginning to suspect they understood nothing of what kept a house alive. Nothing dramatic occurred. "No question. No bow." Yet when she finished and turned, she found him still there, his expression thoughtful and unguarded in a way she was beginning to understand as rare. When she frowned over a total, he bent beside her shoulder, and together they found the error in silence. In the days that followed, Westridge began revealing itself to Eleanor not through its grandeur but through its habits. In the east nursery, where sunlight, thin and amber, moved over old toys, mothball chests, and folded cloth, she set herself to choosing which curtains could be remade for the tenant's schoolroom rather than discarded. At first the servants watched her with the caution reserved for new authority, uncertain whether this attention would become interference. Instead they discovered that she listened before she altered anything, and that when she changed a custom she could explain exactly why. "Children need warmth more than symmetry," she said when the seamstress asked whether the faded panels were too humble to reuse. The sentence went farther through the house than any command would have done, because it made plain that she expected competence rather than displays of fear. Adrian came upon her there one afternoon and paused without announcing himself, simply observing the ease with which she made order seem less like discipline than mercy. He thought of all the women he had known who confused elegance with value and felt unexpectedly ashamed for once having admired that confusion. Nothing dramatic occurred. "No question. No bow." Yet when she finished and turned, she found him still there, his expression thoughtful and unguarded in a way she was beginning to understand as rare. He remembered later that this was the afternoon he first imagined her at the center of his house, not as a legal necessity but as its heart. In the days that followed, Westridge began revealing itself to Eleanor not through its grandeur but through its habits. In the estate office, where ink, sealing wax, damp wool, and the faint iron smell of a coal grate mixed in the close room, she set herself to reviewing rent rolls and remission requests from tenants whose harvest carts had broken on the South Road. At first the servants watched her with the caution reserved for new authority, uncertain whether this attention would become interference. Instead they discovered that she listened before she altered anything, and that when she changed a custom she could explain exactly why. "Mercy without record breeds chaos, but record without mercy breeds resentment," she said while rewriting a column in her neat hand. The sentence went farther through the house than any command would have done, because it made plain that she expected competence rather than displays of fear. Adrian came upon her there one afternoon and paused without announcing himself, simply observing the ease with which she made order seem less like discipline than mercy. He had spent years governing by policy. She did not replace policy, only show him where humanity belonged inside it. Nothing dramatic occurred. No question. No bow. Yet when she finished and turned, she found him still there, his expression thoughtful and unguarded in a way she was beginning to understand as rare. Afterward he amended 2 decisions and pretended he had meant to do so before entering the room. In the days that followed, Westridge began revealing itself to Eleanor not through its grandeur but through its habits. In the small chapel vestibule, where the flagstones held the memory of cold and the old carved wood smelled faintly of polish and age, she set herself to having the candle inventory moved nearer the vestry so elderly tenants would not stand in drafts during services. At first the servants watched her with the caution reserved for new authority, uncertain whether this attention would become interference. Instead they discovered that she listened before she altered anything, and that when she changed a custom she could explain exactly why. Reverence need not be uncomfortable to be sincere, she told the vicar's wife with a grave little smile. The sentence went farther through the house than any command would have done, because it made plain that she expected competence rather than displays of fear. Adrian came upon her there one afternoon and paused without announcing himself, simply observing the ease with which she made order seem less like discipline than mercy. He understood then that her kindness was never ornamental. It always arrived attached to a practical correction. Nothing dramatic occurred. No question. No bow. Yet when she finished and turned, she found him still there, his expression thoughtful and unguarded in a way she was beginning to understand as rare. That evening he found himself waiting to hear what she would notice next. In the days that followed, Westridge began revealing itself to Eleanor not through its grandeur but through its habits. In the conservatory, where mist purled on the glass and the earth smelled rich, green, and secretly alive despite the season, she set herself to staking a leaning orange sapling and trimming away blight with the gardener. At first the servants watched her with the caution reserved for new authority, uncertain whether this attention would become interference. Instead they discovered that she listened before she altered anything, and that when she changed a custom she could explain exactly why. Neglect rarely announces itself at first, she said, touching one yellowed leaf. It begins by asking for just one more day. The sentence went farther through the house than any command would have done, because it made plain that she expected competence rather than displays of fear. Adrian came upon her there one afternoon and paused without announcing himself, simply observing the ease with which she made order seem less like discipline than mercy. The words were about plants and not about plants, and he felt them reach places in him he had boarded over years ago. Nothing dramatic occurred. No question. No bow. Yet when she finished and turned, she found him still there, his expression thoughtful and unguarded in a way she was beginning to understand as rare. He offered her the gardening knife by its handle, careful of her fingers, and she noticed the care. In the days that followed, Westridge began revealing itself to Eleanor not through its grandeur but through its habits. In the housekeeper's room, where ledgers, mended sheets, and the ghost of starch hung in the warm air, she set herself to paring back duplicate linen orders and reallocating the savings to shoe leather for the stable boys. At first the servants watched her with the caution reserved for new authority, uncertain whether this attention would become interference. Instead they discovered that she listened before she altered anything, and that when she changed a custom she could explain exactly why. A polished table means little if boys carry wood in split boots, she said, and even Mrs. Grant, who admired caution more than sentiment, looked startled into approval. The sentence went farther through the house than any command would have done, because it made plain that she expected competence rather than displays of fear. Adrian came upon her there one afternoon and paused without announcing himself, simply observing the ease with which she made order seem less like discipline than mercy. He knew then that she measured dignity differently from society, and that her measure was better. Nothing dramatic occurred. No question. No bow. Yet when she finished and turned, she found him still there, his expression thoughtful and unguarded in a way she was beginning to understand as rare. When he thanked her that night, She seemed more surprised by thanks than by responsibility. In the days that followed, Westridge began revealing itself to Eleanor not through its grandeur but through its habits. In the library window seat, where rain stitched silver lines down the panes while the leather of old volumes breathed out dust and cedar, she set herself to copying older estate correspondence into a cleaner index so petitions would stop being misplaced. At first the servants watched her with the caution reserved for new authority, uncertain whether this attention would become interference. Instead they discovered that she listened before she altered anything, and that when she changed a custom she could explain exactly why. "People should not vanish merely because their papers do," she murmured when a request from a tenant widow turned up months late behind a folio atlas. The sentence went farther through the house than any command would have done, because it made plain that she expected competence rather than displays of fear. Adrian came upon her there one afternoon and paused without announcing himself, simply observing the ease with which she made order seem less like discipline than mercy. He heard, beneath the remark, the shape of a life spent refusing to let others disappear from consideration. Nothing dramatic occurred. "No confession. No bow." Yet when she finished and turned, she found him still there, his expression thoughtful and unguarded in a way she was beginning to understand as rare. He sat opposite with his own dispatches and found, to his astonishment, that shared silence could feel companionable. The moment that changed the house could have been mistaken, by anyone less attentive than the people involved, for a matter of furniture. It happened on a morning so bright with frost that the lawns looked sugared and brittle. Eleanor came down earlier than usual to find the long dining room laid for breakfast, though only 2 people ever ate there. The footmen had already begun their solemn procession of trays from the distant kitchens. Toast cooled on its journey. Conversation, if attempted, arrived exhausted. She stood in the doorway, looked at the glittering parade of inconvenience, and said, almost to herself, "This is nonsense." Mrs. Grant, hovering nearby, blinked. "Madam, a breakfast for 2 should not require the logistics of a military campaign. Is there a smaller room with morning light and a table round enough that one need not call across silver to be heard?" There was a blue morning room on the south side, used chiefly in April and almost forgotten in November. By 11 o'clock Eleanor had ordered the fires lit there, the windows polished, and a small walnut table brought in from a side parlor where it had languished beneath potted ferns. She chose plain cream linen, a brown teapot that actually poured well, and no more serving pieces than 2 people might sensibly require. When Adrian was told that breakfast would be taken there the next day if it pleased him, he asked only one question. "Whose idea was this?" "Her Grace's, Your Grace," said the butler. The next morning he entered the blue room expecting efficiency and found intimacy instead. Sunlight fell in a pale gold square across the carpet. Frost silvered the window panes. The small round table sat before the fire like an argument in favor of human scale. Eleanor was already there, not dressed for display but for the day. Gray wool, high collar, long sleeves, hair smooth, account notebook at one elbow and marmalade at the other. She looked up when he came in, and because the room no longer allowed the distance of titles to do so much work, her slight uncertainty was visible too. "I hope you do not object," she said. He looked at the table, then at her. "On the contrary, I object only to having endured the previous arrangement for so long." That earned him not the almost smile, but a true one, brief, quick as light on water. Worth more, he thought with sudden dangerous clarity, than most victories he had ever pursued. They breakfasted facing one another, not like emissaries but like people. The servants came and went with less ceremony and more ease. The tea stayed hot. Marianne's latest letter from Vale House could be discussed without raising voices. Adrian told a story, dryly, unexpectedly, about a bishop who had once nodded into a trifle during a county dinner. Eleanor laughed aloud. Mrs. Grant, passing the doorway, nearly stopped in the hall from shock. Afterward Adrian did not leave at once. He remained while Eleanor opened the dairy accounts and asked whether he meant to renew the lease on the Mill Stream parcel. He pulled his chair nearer instead of standing over her shoulder. Their sleeves almost touched as they bent over the page. Once, when she reached for the ink at the same time he did, their hands met lightly. Neither withdrew very quickly. It was a small scene. No vow was spoken. No music marked it. Yet by evening even the upper housemaids knew something significant had shifted. The Duchess had moved breakfast. The Duke had stayed. A great cold room had lost to a little warm one. The following day Adrian had a carpenter shorten the sideboard so the blue room might hold flowers in spring without feeling crowded. Eleanor said nothing of the gesture. Neither did he. The silence between them had changed species. It no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. When the house resumed itself after that small interruption of happiness, it did so on altered terms. Adrian began seeking her opinion before signing estate directives. Eleanor stopped addressing him as Your Grace when they were alone unless anger or embarrassment required formality as a shield. Once, finding her hands chilled from a walk through the tenant cottages, he took them between his own before the fire without appearing to realize what an intimate act it was. Or perhaps he realized it too late, because the look that followed in his eyes made Eleanor's pulse misbehave for the rest of the afternoon. The person who understood the change first and best was not either of them. It was the Dowager Duchess of Westridge. Lady Beatrice Ashbourne arrived a week later in a traveling chaise small enough to suggest she disliked spectacle and old enough to prove she did not require novelty. She was silver-haired, upright, and composed with that particular kind of authority age sometimes lends women after the world has exhausted its attempts to arrange them. Her gowns were dark silk, modest and severe in cut, relieved only by excellent lace and eyes far too intelligent to be called merely kind. Eleanor met her in the entrance hall with every expectation of polite scrutiny and possible disappointment. The dowager studied her once from collar to hem, once from eyes to hands, and then said, "So, you are the woman who made my grandson move breakfast." Eleanor, caught between alarm and laughter, chose honesty. "I did move breakfast, madam." "Then half the county owes you gratitude already." That was the beginning. Beatrice did not offer empty comfort. She offered alignment. Over tea she asked sensible questions about the East Farms and even more sensible ones about Adrian's temper, habits, and silences. By supper she had decided Eleanor possessed both steadiness and humor, which in her estimation ranked above prettiness and far above social glitter. In return, Eleanor discovered that the dowager's sharpness concealed not coldness but fatigue with foolishness. "He has been dutiful so long," Beatrice said the next afternoon as they walked slowly through the conservatory, "that he mistakes desire for irresponsibility whenever it concerns himself. His father's charm left debris. Adrian spent years learning that feelings, indulged carelessly, injure households. He overcorrected." Eleanor touched the leaf of an orange tree she had recently saved from rot. "And so he built a life no one could accuse of carelessness." "Exactly. Unfortunately, well-constructed prisons remain prisons." The older woman paused before a bench where winter geraniums glowed red against the gray light. "Do not excuse him too much. Severity is often only fear with better tailoring. But do not mistake his restraint for indifference. If Adrian has chosen, he has chosen with his whole nature. The difficulty lies in making him speak what he considers obvious." Eleanor absorbed that in silence. Being told not to mistake restraint for indifference would have sounded like manipulation from almost anyone else. From Beatrice, it sounded like a map drawn by someone who had already walked the terrain. Before leaving the conservatory, the dowager presented Eleanor with a box. Inside lay a gown of quiet blue silk, deep as dusk and cut in the modest, high-waisted Regency line proper to the period. Long sleeves of fine gauze over silk, a fully covered neckline softened by delicate ruching, and a floor-length skirt that fell in clean, elegant lines without any vulgar invitation to display. "For London," Beatrice said, "you are not to outshine fools by trying to become one. But neither are you obliged to dress as if the world has the right to ignore you." Eleanor ran her fingers over the fabric. The color was calm, unboastful, and impossible to dismiss. "It is beautiful." "Yes," said Beatrice dryly. "That is why I chose it." Adrian saw the gown that evening when Eleanor, at Beatrice's insistence, held the silk against herself before the drawing-room fire. He stopped halfway through the door. The blue did not transform her into someone else. It did something more unsettling. It made visible what had been there all along. The steadiness of her posture, the clarity of her eyes, the restrained grace of a woman who had never courted attention and therefore had never learned to squander it. "My grandmother is campaigning," he said. Beatrice looked up from her book. "I am correcting." Eleanor should have been embarrassed. Instead, she felt a strange new sensation unfurling beneath her ribs. Not vanity. Permission. That night Adrian told himself he would keep London brief. A few appearances. Necessary calls. Enough to still questions regarding the marriage. He told himself Lady Sybil Fenwick, whose family had expected an alliance with Westridge for 3 consecutive seasons, would understand that expectation and entitlement are not vows. He told himself all this with the confidence of a man who had not yet measured the full spite of thwarted ambition. London received the new Duchess of Westridge as London receives most women not previously approved by it, with appetite sharpened by uncertainty. At Lady Caro Musicale, one viscountess asked whether her grace had always preferred practical colors or had chosen grey only until a duke improved her prospects. The comments never landed as direct blows at first. They came disguised as curiosity, concern, and the polished cruelty of people who considered rudeness beneath them while practicing it to perfection. A ripple of laughter followed, soft enough to preserve manners and sharp enough to draw blood. Eleanor answered with such calm precision that some withdrew out of boredom and others out of discomfort. Adrian watched more than he intervened in those early moments, not because he failed to see the cuts, but because he knew too well how society punishes women whose husbands appear to shield them from every breeze. It was a mistake, though an understandable one. She could endure insult. What hurt was being left to endure it alone. In the carriage home, Adrian said, "I should have answered sooner." Eleanor looked out at the lamps and replied, "Yes, you should have." By the time they returned home that evening, both were carrying the same silence for different reasons. He apologized then, plainly, and she believed him, which made forgiveness both easier and more dangerous. London received the new Duchess of Westridge as London receives most women not previously approved by it, with appetite sharpened by uncertainty. At the promenade in Hyde Park, Lady Sybil Fenwick drew her phaeton near enough to congratulate Eleanor on rising so efficiently from obscurity. The comments never landed as direct blows at first. They came disguised as curiosity, concern, and the polished cruelty of people who considered rudeness beneath them while practicing it to perfection. Sybil smiled as she spoke, a beautiful smile practiced into something nearly indistinguishable from hostility. Eleanor answered with such calm precision that some withdrew out of boredom and others out of discomfort. Adrian watched more than he intervened in those early moments, not because he failed to see the cuts, but because he knew too well how society punishes women whose husbands appear to shield them from every breeze. It was a mistake, though an understandable one. She could endure insult. What hurt was being left to endure it alone. Adrian touched 2 fingers to the carriage frame and said in a tone the whole row heard, "My wife requires no instruction in dignity, Lady Sybil." It was not yet the full defense Eleanor needed, but it was the first public sign that he understood the contest had become personal. By the time they returned home that evening, both were carrying the same silence for different reasons. That night Eleanor slept badly and admitted, against pride, that the small defense had mattered. London received the new Duchess of Westridge as London receives most women not previously approved by it, with appetite sharpened by uncertainty. At the circulating library on Bond Street, 2 matrons lowered their voices only enough to ensure Eleanor could still hear them speculate about whether village marriages were the newest route to coronets. The comments never landed as direct blows at first. They came disguised as curiosity, concern, and the polished cruelty of people who considered rudeness beneath them while practicing it to perfection. The cruelty was almost lazy, which somehow made it worse. Eleanor answered with such calm precision that some withdrew out of boredom and others out of discomfort. Adrian watched more than he intervened in those early moments, not because he failed to see the cuts, but because he knew too well how society punishes women whose husbands appear to shield them from every breeze. It was a mistake, though an understandable one. She could endure insult. What hurt was being left to endure it alone. Adrian crossed the room, took the volume from Eleanor's hand only to pay for it and place it back with deliberate courtesy. then offered his arm without a word. He did not theatrically silence anyone. Instead he behaved as though her place beside him were so established that comment became vulgar by comparison by the time they returned home that evening. Both were carrying the same silence for different reasons. The gesture steadied her for the rest of the afternoon and unsettled him for much longer. London received the new Duchess of Westridge as London receives most women not previously approved by it, with appetite sharpened by uncertainty. At a small supper in Berkeley Square, Sybil spoke tenderly of duty and old expectations while every listener understood exactly whose disappointment she meant to sanctify. The comments never landed as direct blows at first. They came disguised as curiosity, concern, and the polished cruelty of people who considered rudeness beneath them while practicing it to perfection. For one brutal quarter-hour Eleanor felt herself transformed from person to anecdote. Eleanor answered with such calm precision that some withdrew out of boredom and others out of discomfort. Adrian watched more than he intervened in those early moments, not because he failed to see the cuts, but because he knew too well how society punishes women whose husbands appear to shield them from every breeze. It was a mistake, though an understandable one. She could endure insult. What hurt was being left to endure it alone. Later, in the lamplight of their own drawing room, Adrian admitted that Sybil's family had indeed been encouraged by others for years, though never by him. "I should have ended the assumption publicly long before now," he said. "I was careless where your peace was concerned." By the time they returned home that evening, both were carrying the same silence for different reasons. She told him carelessness and malice are not identical, but they can leave similar bruises. He never forgot the sentence. It might have remained only bruising social whether if Lady Sybil Fenwick had possessed the ordinary vanity of ordinary belles. But Sybil's pride had roots. Her father's estates had been sinking under elegant debt for years. The Westridge marriage had not merely represented triumph. It had represented repair, security, vindication for a household that spent lavishly to avoid admitting it was cornered. To lose that expectation to an unknown woman in gray was not, in Sybil's private creed, disappointment. It was humiliation made visible. That did not excuse her. It explained her. By the time winter thinned and the first harder light of January began cutting the city cleanly in two, glamour above, panic below, Sybil's attentions had sharpened from slighting elegance into design. A whispered remark here, a too sympathetic glance there. Questions about Eleanor's family finances asked only where the answer would travel widely. Marianne, writing from Vale House with more honesty than tact, mentioned that Lydia had accepted invitations from acquaintances eager to discuss what it felt like to have a sister rise so abruptly. Adrian read the line over Eleanor's shoulder and swore softly. "Do not blame Lydia for being weak where she has always been weak," Eleanor said. "Blame the people who know exactly how to use weakness for entertainment." He looked at her then with the mixture of admiration and frustration she was beginning to recognize. "You defend everyone except yourself. Someone must keep the list accurate." "I did not marry accuracy." The words surprised them both. He seemed almost startled by his own tone. She held very still. "No," she said after a moment. "You married necessity." His jaw tightened. "That is not all I married." "Then you should not leave me to guess the rest." He took a step toward her and stopped. Some old habit, control, caution, fear of saying too much before certainty became irreversible, rose between them again like a gate. "When I speak it," he said quietly, "I want there to be no room for you to doubt what I mean. And until then I ask you to trust what I do." It was a flawed answer. It was also the answer of a man whose feelings had become too large for easy phrasing. Eleanor should have been consoled less by that than she was. The greater danger entered Westridge not through society, however, but through paperwork. Mrs. Grant sent up an old packet of estate vouchers requiring the Duke's signature. Among them Eleanor found a copied page in the same clerkly hand she had seen months before in the duplicate coal invoices. Figures had been altered, not crudely, intelligently. Rent dates shifted, grain tallies smoothed, enough to hide diversion over time from a distracted eye. Nathaniel Pritchard's initials sat in the corner like a smirk. She carried the page straight to Adrian. He read it once and his expression emptied of all softness. Pritchard, you suspected? I suspected incompetence, not embezzlement of this patience. He may have believed great houses never examine small thefts. Adrian rang for his secretary. Orders flew. Letters went out. Quiet inquiries began. Yet men who steal from powerful households seldom act alone when cornered. By the time the first responses returned, Pritchard had vanished from his London lodgings. Lady Sybil, meanwhile, grew only sweeter in public. Eleanor disliked sweetness that appeared after desperation had reason to arm itself. The attack, when it came, advanced in stages exactly suited to a woman who preferred polished knives. First, there was the suggestion that the Duchess of Westridge had shown remarkable familiarity with estate matters before her marriage, implying that a village gentlewoman could not possibly know such things unless encouraged into private confidence. Then there was the rumor that the marriage had been arranged with suspicious speed because certain Vale debts could not withstand scrutiny. Finally, there came a note without signature delivered to Eleanor's private sitting room in a plain hand that made no attempt at elegance. If Her Grace wishes to avoid a public discussion of her family's insolvency and the source of the Duke's sudden attachment, she will advise His Grace to let the old vouchers rest. Curiosity can be expensive. No threat could have been more carefully aimed. Not at her pride, at her usefulness, at the fear that the household she had been taken in to preserve might be endangered because she had begun uncovering truths too near somebody else's need. Adrian found the note on her desk where she had left it instead of hiding it. He read it and became, in an instant, terrifyingly calm. "This ends now," he said. "It ends carefully," Eleanor corrected. "If Sybil is involved, she will have prepared denial. If Pritchard is involved, he will have prepared escape. You speak as if you have known blackmail before." She met his gaze. "I have known people who count on shame doing their work for them." That stopped him. They worked together then as they should perhaps have worked from the first. He with reach, she with pattern. Eleanor ordered every household ledger copied and compared. Adrian had Tom Wren question grooms, carriers, and a printer's apprentice in Holborn, who occasionally supplemented his wages by reproducing gentlemen's hands. Mrs. Grant, grave and loyal now beyond doubt, quietly discovered that one of Sybil Fenwick's maids had been paid recently in guineas too new for her station. Beatrice, informed at last, called it exactly what it was. A woman drowning who has chosen to climb onto another woman's head instead of learning to swim. The dowager's mouth hardened. Understandable in origin. Damnable in execution. The final piece came from the very habit Lydia and Marianne had mocked for years. Eleanor took the forged page and compared its quarter-day calculations to the real Westridge grain receipts. The totals matched at a glance and failed on patience. Copied some used Lady Day adjustments where Michaelmas figures belonged. The error was small enough for pride to miss and obvious enough for a woman who had spent winters deciding whether beeswax could be stretched another fortnight. "There," she said, tapping the line. Adrian bent close. His shoulder touched hers. "You are certain?" "Entirely. Whoever altered this understood display, not practice." He copied what looked orderly, not what a working estate actually does. His dark eyes lifted to her face. In them was anger, yes, but beneath the anger a fiercer, steadier thing. "Oh!" It made breathing oddly difficult. "You save what you enter," he said, almost to himself. She looked back at the page because that was safer than looking back at him. The next public assembly at Westridge House was already scheduled. A winter charity concert and supper attended by half the people whose approval society worshipped and the other half whose gossip it feared. Beatrice urged cancellation. Adrian refused. "If they mean to force a scene," he said, "let them do it where truth can answer loudly." Eleanor's pulse kicked once at that word. Loudly. He had been quiet for so long. It seemed impossible and inevitable that he would not remain so forever. Before the evening arrived, Lydia came to London uninvited, white-faced and ashamed. She had overheard enough at a call in Brook Street to understand that Sybil meant to make public use of Vale family debts, and of some fabricated correspondence suggesting Eleanor had encouraged Adrian's disguised night visit through clandestine messages. Lydia had not written of it because she feared being blamed for providing any information at all. "I was foolish," she confessed in Eleanor's room, twisting her gloves. I liked being noticed. And then I discovered people will notice anything if they hope it makes another woman smaller. Eleanor embraced her. Not because Lydia deserved easy absolution, but because repentance, when real, ought to be allowed somewhere to stand. Then stand better now, she said. That is all apology is for. Lydia wept into her sister's shoulder as Marian hovered near the door in mortified sympathy. The moment might have been sentimental in another house. Here it felt practical. Another loose thread caught before it could tear more cloth. In the 3 days before the concert, the house breathed as if it knew confrontation was approaching and disliked drafts from that direction. Florists came and went through the service yard. Silver was polished. Lists were checked and rechecked. Footmen rehearsed routes for circulating trays as though the shape of a supper procession might prevent disaster if arranged correctly enough. Eleanor moved through the preparations with outward composure and inward strain. She had spent years managing domestic pressure, but this kind was different. It did not threaten linen stores or winter coal. It threatened meaning. It threatened the right to have her marriage understood by anyone beyond the two people living inside it. On the second afternoon, she escaped to the library under the pretense of reviewing donation subscriptions for the charity concert. Adrian found her there standing motionless at the window, one hand resting on the frame. The city spread beyond as a blur of roofs and pale smoke. "You have been upright too long," he said quietly. "Even statues sit for restoration." She almost smiled, but the expression failed before it formed. "If I sit, I may begin to think. And that would be intolerable? Present, yes." He came to stand beside her, not touching, merely near enough that his steadiness entered the air around her. The library at Westridge House in town was smaller than the one at the country seat, but warmer, lined with walnut shelves and lit by the kind of late winter light that made dust look like faded gold. "Tell me the most practical version of your fear," he said. "Not the prettiest, not the bravest, the accurate one." She turned then, drawn by the wording if not by relief. "The practical version? Very well. That if this scandal is not answered cleanly, every decent thing we have built since the wedding becomes vulnerable to contempt. My sisters will carry the stain. Your servants will be asked to choose whether they obey respectably or merely dutifully. Every improvement at Westridge will be recast as the meddling of an interloper. And worst of all," she stopped. "Worst of all?" Her voice softened, grew more dangerous for its honesty. "Worst of all, I know I can endure being disliked. I do not know whether I can endure being made into an explanation for harm done to you." Something moved through his face, swift and unguarded. "Eleanor, nothing done by Sybil or Pritchard is your burden to explain." "No. But if the room decides it is, then the room may learn its error from me." She looked at him steadily. "That is what frightens me. Not that you will defend me, that you will do so from duty and the room will call it gallantry." He inhaled once, sharply. "And if I do so from love?" The words stood between them, unsheltered at last. Not a full declaration, perhaps, but its unmistakable border. Eleanor's fingers tightened against the window frame. "Then say it where no one can rename it for us." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper worn soft at the edges. "I had thought to wait until after the concert. Waiting has not improved any previous situation between us, so perhaps I should stop treating delay as wisdom." He handed her the sheet. It was old, months old at least, and bore figures in a hand she recognized as her own. At the bottom of a copied list of grain estimates she had once drafted for her father was a note she had forgotten writing. "If the Miller boys are to be paid late, tell them plainly. Men can survive short coin better than hidden contempt." "Where did you get this?" she asked. "Tom Wren brought it to me in autumn with 2 others. Your father had asked advice once of an estate man who reported to one of my agents. The advice never traveled upward, but the copied sheets did. Tom said, 'If your grace means to marry a woman who knows the difference between shortage and humiliation.' I kept the papers because I had never seen household numbers annotated with moral intelligence." He gave a short, self-mocking breath, an unforgivably grand phrase. "I warned you the truth might sound arrogant or absurd." She looked down again at the note, at the younger self preserved in ink without her knowledge, and felt something inside her settle into place. He had begun seeing her before the storm, before the disguise, before the bargain itself. The knowledge did not erase the injury of his silence. It transformed its shape. "You came to test the stories," she said. "I came to see whether competence and kindness could inhabit the same person as completely as rumor claimed. I had become suspicious of every prettier promise. Then you opened the door in the rain and looked at me as if discomfort, not rank, were the relevant fact. I was lost from that point onward, though I disguised it from both of us with appalling discipline." The last phrase won her a real smile at last, small but luminous. He watched it arrive with the awe of a man who knew he had earned it badly and valued it precisely for that reason. "You might have told me sooner," she said. "I might have. I was afraid that if I confessed to seeking you out, the choice I offered would feel less free." His expression darkened with honesty. "And perhaps I was also afraid that once the truth was spoken, I would no longer be able to pretend this marriage was manageable on practical terms." She folded the paper carefully. "It has not seemed particularly manageable for some time." That drew laughter from both of them, soft and tired and more intimate than many embraces. When the laughter faded, Adrian lifted his hand, not quickly, not assuming, and touched the edge of the paper still held in her fingers. "Keep it," he said. "If tonight becomes ugly, let this remind you that whatever began in necessity has long since outrun it." She kept the paper. Later, while her maid fastened the blue gown and arranged the pearls, Eleanor slipped the folded sheet inside the small inner pocket sewn discreetly into her reticule. She did not need it for courage exactly. Courage had never been her shortage. She needed it for certainty. There is a difference. By the time the first carriage lamps appeared outside Westridge House that evening, she was ready. Not because scandal could not wound her, but because truth at last had somewhere inside her to stand. The night of the concert arrived under a sky so clear it seemed sharpened by cold. London glittered. Carriages lined the street before Westridge House in black and gold succession. Footmen moved like clockwork. Candles multiplied themselves in mirrors until the ballroom appeared to hold not one assembly but 100, each equally determined to witness, judge, and remember. Eleanor wore the blue gown Beatrice had chosen. Deep, quietly luminous, modest in the exactness of its Regency line, long-sleeved and fully covered, the color of evening held still. She wore no excessive jewels, only her mother's pearls at throat and wrists. Around her, women flashed brighter shades, lower daring, louder embroidery. She did not compete. That was the point. The effect was not invisibility anymore. It was authority without performance. Adrian, in black and white with the star of an office granted through royal service catching one measured shard of light at his breast, met her at the top of the stair before they descended. He said nothing at first. Neither did she. There are moments when speech only shrinks what the eyes already understand. Finally he offered his arm. "You are exactly as you ought to be." The words were simple. In any other mouth they might have sounded insufficient. In his they landed with grave precision. Eleanor placed her hand on his sleeve and felt, beneath the disciplined fabric, the live tension of a man about to stop enduring in silence. The early part of the evening passed almost peacefully. Music rose. Conversation wheeled. Donations were announced for tenant widows and parish schools. Sybil moved through the crowd in silver gauze and cultivated serenity, receiving compliments as though nothing in her had ever soured. Pritchard, Eleanor noticed with one hard turn of surprise, had somehow obtained entrance among the lesser guests through sponsorship by one of Fenwick's political cousins. He kept near the rear, oily with attempted invisibility. Adrian saw him too, his jaw set. "Not yet," Eleanor murmured. He looked at her, startled, then inclined his head once. Trust. There it was at last, working both ways. The quadrille ended. Supper was announced in the adjoining rooms. Before the company could fully disperse, Lady Sybil stepped forward with the unhurried courage of someone who has rehearsed outrage until it resembles virtue. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying just far enough, "before the evening closes, I would ask whether it is true that certain documents regarding the circumstances of your marriage have been suppressed to spare your lady embarrassment." The room altered at once. Conversation broke, folded, and broke again in whispers. Fans stilled. Men pretended not to turn while turning unmistakably. Beatrice, across the room, closed her eyes once as if praying for patience. Adrian's reply came cold and controlled. "If you have a concern, Lady Sybil, you may speak to me privately tomorrow." "I think not," she said with a smile intended to look regretful. "When a duchess's rise has depended upon secrecy, those welcomed under her roof may reasonably wish to know what kind." She signaled. Pritchard stepped forward carrying a packet. Eleanor felt the precise instant society decided it was about to be entertained. Sybil continued, "Here are copies of correspondence and account pages indicating that Miss Vale, before she became her grace, was in improper communication with your household, that she knew your incognito movements in advance, and that the sudden wedding was arranged under pressure of debts her family hoped to hide. I say this not from malice, but from concern that an honorable gentleman has been manipulated by a practiced obscurity." It was well phrased. That made it fouler. A small exclamation rose somewhere near the musicians. Lydia, white as salt, gripped Marianne's wrist. Pritchard held out the forged packet with the smug humility of a man who had rented out his conscience so long he mistook the absence for professionalism. Adrian did not take it. Eleanor did. She opened the top page with fingers that did not shake, though her heartbeat struck at her ribs like a hand on a locked door. The room watched, greedy for collapse. She read. A forged note in a counterfeit feminine hand. A copied ledger entry. Pasted seal. Workmanlike enough for scandal. Poor work for truth. She lifted her eyes first to Pritchard. "You copied the figures from a Michaelmas table and adjusted them as if the collection were made at Lady Day." He stared. Several guests blinked, disappointed already that arithmetic had entered their drama. Eleanor turned the page. Her voice remained calm, almost conversational, which made the silence around it strain harder to hear. "You also dated a supply remission 2 weeks before the storm that destroyed the West Bridge, though the real remission was granted after the storm because the tenant carts could no longer reach market. Anyone who managed actual receipts would know that. Anyone who only copied surfaces would not." Pritchard flushed blotchy red. Sybil's poise tightened by a hair. Eleanor went on, and now there was iron in the calm. "This seal has been pressed from the wrong side of a chipped impression. The original Westridge seal bears a nick at the lower griffin's wing. The forgery places that nick too high, and this hand," she held up the supposed letter, "attempts refinement by hesitation. It mistakes elegance for uncertainty. I do not write like a woman asking permission to exist." A murmur rippled outward, different now. Not delight. Recognition. Sybil's smile failed at last. "You expect us to believe a village girl can unpick every line of a gentleman's papers merely by looking?" Before Eleanor could answer, Adrian stepped forward. The movement was so measured that the room seemed to move back from him without anyone taking a visible step. "No," he said. "They are to believe that my wife can unpick falsehood because she has spent years preserving households while people like you perform superiority in better-lit rooms." Something broke open in the atmosphere. It had the terrible beauty of a storm finally choosing where to strike. Adrian took the forged pages from Eleanor's hand, not to protect her from them, but to stand beside the truth she had already named. He turned first to Pritchard. "You stole from my estate," he said. "Then, when discovery approached, you sought shelter in a lie large enough to bury a woman's name beneath it. You will have neither my silence nor my roof for the attempt." Pritchard opened his mouth, closed it again, and looked desperately toward Sybil. It was the glance of a servant who had mistaken patronage for loyalty. Sybil lifted her chin. Beauty remained with her. Composure did not. "You would take the word of a nobody over evidence?" "Evidence?" Adrian's voice sharpened. "A counterfeit sum, a backward seal, a bought copyist, and the testimony of desperation? You mistake arrangement for proof, Lady Sybil, because arrangement has always carried you farther than integrity." There were gasps now, though whether at his bluntness or her exposure even society could not decide. He did not stop. Years of discipline, reserve, and delayed speech had reached their limit, and the force released by restraint is often greater than the force of anger freely spent. You wish to know why I married Eleanor Vale? He asked the room. No one answered. They were no longer an audience. They were witnesses. Then hear me clearly, because I will not say it twice in fragments. I did not choose her for her gown. I did not choose her for her portion. I did not choose her because she knew how to flatter a title, angle herself toward a coronet, or turn helplessness into bait. I did not choose her because she glittered in crowded rooms. I did not choose her because other people approved the match before I made it. I chose her because when I came to her door with mud on my boots and no advantage she could safely count, she gave me warmth before she knew my name. I chose her because while others laughed, she saw a wounded man and answered his need without calculation. I chose her because she keeps ledgers honestly, servants kindly, and promises exactly. I chose her because she mends what the careless discard. I chose her because in a world trained to admire display, she has the rarer courage of substance. I chose her because she can read the health of a household in its accounts, the character of a lie in its smallest figure, and the dignity of a human being where other people see only usefulness. I chose her because she made my house less grand and more alive within a month of entering it. I chose her because breakfast became conversation, duty became partnership, and silence became bearable in her presence. I chose her because she is the first woman in many years who never once treated my rank as the most interesting thing about me. And I chose her because she was worthy of being seen long before any of you bothered to look. The last line rang through the ballroom and found every person who had ever mistaken quietness for insignificance. Eleanor stood very still, not from lack of feeling but because feeling had become too large for movement. Her sisters were crying openly now. Beatrice had one hand over her mouth. Even the musicians stared as if they had forgotten what instruments were for. Sybil's face had gone pale beneath its careful artifice. In that instant Eleanor saw, more clearly than before, the raw structure beneath the malice. A woman taught that admiration was survival, that triumph was rent paid to fear, that if she were not chosen publicly she would disappear privately. The knowledge pierced without pardoning. You built your hopes on expectation, Eleanor said quietly, surprising herself by speaking at all. That was cruelly encouraged in you. But you do not get to answer pain by manufacturing another woman's shame. Sybil laughed once. A brittle thing with no mirth in it. Easy for you to say from a duchess's place. No, Elinor replied. It was difficult to say from a place I stood in long before this one. That ended it more decisively than outrage would have done. Adrian signaled. Two men stepped forward, one his own secretary, one an officer previously placed discreetly among the guests in anticipation that Pritchard's presence might prove useful. Pritchard sagged at the sight of them. The packet was taken. Statements would be drawn. Society, denied the satisfaction of uncertainty, had to content itself with fact. Yet the climax was not complete until Adrian turned back to Eleanor in full view of everyone whose judgment had ever weighed upon such moments. His expression lost none of its intensity, but tenderness entered it openly now, no longer ashamed of being witnessed. I owe you something beyond defense, he said. Her voice failed on the first attempt. The second held. You owe me nothing that was not already true. Then let me say the truth in the only language public rooms understand. He took her hand. The ballroom remained silent enough to hear silk shift at the edge of the crowd. You were seen, Eleanor. Even when they trained you to believe you were made for corners and account books and useful shadows, you were seen. I saw you that night before I told you who I was. I had heard of a woman who held a failing household together and wanted to know whether the stories had exaggerated. They had not. If anything, they had been too small. The withheld truth landed gently, not as insult but as revelation. He had come because of her. Not by whim. Not by accident. He had sought the truth of her and trusted it more than the performances of a dozen drawing rooms. Old Tom told you, she whispered. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. Among others. He told me there was a woman at Vale House who knew the weight of coal, the names of tenants' children, and the cost of being overlooked without permitting it to sour her. I thought he was indulging sentiment. Then I watched you offer kindness to a stranger no one expected you to value. The rest became inevitable. Tears threatened. Eleanor had no wish to weep before a room full of people who once would have called tears feminine proof and now would call them moving. She drew one breath, then another. "You tested me." His thumb moved once over her knuckles, a gesture private enough to hurt. "I came to see whether the stories were true. What I found was more than truth. It was character. I should have told you sooner. For that I ask forgiveness, not indulgence." The apology, offered before everyone, without excuse, altered even that old wound into something less jagged. Eleanor looked at him and understood at last that his reserve had not been indifference. It had been fear of speaking imperfectly where he wanted to mean everything. He had chosen poorly in silence and magnificently in declaration. "Then I forgive you," she said, and the room exhaled. Somebody began to clap, then stopped, mortified by the impropriety. Beatrice saved them all by declaring in tones crisp enough to slice pastry, "If anyone has finished embarrassing themselves, the orchestra may resume." Laughter followed, real, relieved, and no longer pointed at the wrong person. When the first notes of the next set began, Adrian did not release Eleanor's hand. "Dance with me," he said. The room was still too attentive. The request therefore felt astonishingly private. He led her onto the floor while the assembly, polite at last, found new occupations in supper and strategic blindness. The dance itself scarcely mattered. What mattered was that the man who had once sat a room's length away now stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through linen and wool, close enough to hear the roughened edge beneath his control. "I have done this badly at every stage except perhaps the first and the last," he said. "Not every stage," she answered. "Most of them, then. Enough to be irritating. Not enough to be unforgivable." His laugh was low and breathless with relief. "You are mercilessly fair. You seem to like that in me. I seem to like nearly everything in you." The candor of it sent color into her face more effectively than compliments ever had. They turned with the music, slow and measured. Beyond the windows, the city glittered in winter blackness. Within the circle of his arm, the ballroom's judgment lost all dominion. When the dance ended, he drew her, with perfect propriety and unmistakable intention, through the side doors into the long gallery where moonlight fell across portraits and marble. The house had gone hushed behind them. He stopped beneath a window and looked at her as though seeing and being seen had finally become the same act. "Eleanor," he said, her name now a vow more than a form of address, "I married you for reasons that began in necessity. I love you for reasons necessity could never have arranged." There it was. No hedging. No polished half-measure. The sentence entered her like warmth returning to numb hands. Painful first, then miraculous. She touched his coat sleeve lightly, then more surely. "I think," she said, and had to smile because tears had become too near to permit solemnity, "that I began loving you somewhere between the dairy accounts and the absurdly improved breakfasts." His forehead came gently against hers in a gesture more intimate than any kiss she had imagined. When he did kiss her, it was with reverence before hunger, with gratitude before triumph, and with the sort of care that made the future feel less like a cliff and more like a country gradually lit. 9 months later, the blue morning room held spring instead of frost. The windows stood open to a mild breeze carrying lilac from the south lawn. On the small round walnut table lay not only breakfast things but estate plans, school subscriptions, and a new ledger ruled in Eleanor's own hand for the charitable library she and Beatrice had established for tenants' families and village girls alike. The old distance of the state dining room had not vanished entirely from Westridge. It simply no longer governed the hours that mattered most. Vale House was secure. Lydia, chastened by humiliation and matured by it, had married no fortune hunter but accepted a sensible partnership with a bookseller's widowed son in Bath, where her taste for color proved useful rather than tyrannical. Marianne, after one dramatic flirtation and 3 tearful letters, became engaged to a curate with a beautiful tenor voice and more integrity than elegance. Elsie still wrote twice a month about weather, preserves, and the health of the kitchen cat. West Acres tenants had come through winter with their roofs and rights intact. Nathaniel Pritchard, faced with handwriting evidence, carrier testimony, and his own bad arithmetic, had confessed enough to ruin employment prospects for life, though Adrian had privately ensured the printer's apprentice who copied at his instruction was given lawful work instead of prison. Poverty recruits easily, Eleanor had said.
Vanity pays badly.
Let justice distinguish between them. He had listened. He increasingly did. As for Lady Sybil Fenwick, she left London with an aunt for the continent under the pretense of health. Society, which never punishes vice so eagerly as failed vice, was harder on her than the courts would have been. Eleanor sometimes thought of her with reluctant pity, not because pity erased harm, but because some tragedies are visible even when one refuses to call them innocent. In the present spring brightness, Adrian stood at the window reading a dispatch and pretending not to watch his wife write. He failed at the pretense often now. Eleanor, in a pale dove-blue morning gown with long sleeves and a modest gathered neckline, lifted her head from the ledger. If you continue staring, I shall begin charging you for distraction. Put it under household expenditure, he said, crossing to the table. My distraction is domestic and therefore your department. She smiled up at him. The expression no longer arrived like contraband. It belonged where he did. He set aside the dispatch and reached for the ledger. On the first page she had written 3 columns: school subscriptions, widow relief, and library acquisitions. The sight of her hand among figures still moved him with absurd force. Some men fell in love with beauty at first glance. Adrian had done that too, though he had not named it. But the deeper fall had happened in ink, in steadiness, in the moral exactness with which she held both mercy and order at once. You have added a 4th line, he said. Yes. She touched it with one finger. Repairs to the old schoolroom at Vale. Marion says the roof complains worse than ever. He looked down. Beneath the figure she had written a note in smaller hand. No child should learn beneath a leaking promise. He laughed softly. You continue to improve every place connected to you. Only the places willing to cooperate. He bent and kissed her temple. Then her mouth, as naturally as if the act had been written into the room's architecture from the beginning. From the lawn below came the voices of children brought for the library opening. Beatrice was among them, directing with military calm a procession of baskets, ribbons, and books. Old Tom Wren had sent a hamper of early apples from the north orchard in celebration. On the sideboard lay a stack of copybooks waiting to be distributed, each one ruled with patient lines to receive young, uncertain hands. Eleanor closed the ledger. Years ago, such a sound had meant limits, subtraction, care. Now it also meant foundation. Adrian drew out her chair. Come. They are waiting for their duchess. For the books, I hope. For both. They walked out together through the south doors, past the orange trees saved from blight, down to the lawn where sunlight lay warm upon the grass. Children clustered near the tables. Lydia's latest ribbon donation fluttered from a basket handle. Marianne's promised hymn books had arrived at last. Mrs. Grant supervised refreshments with rigid approval. Beatrice observed everything and missed nothing. When Eleanor paused beside the library table, one little girl in a plain frock looked up at her with the solemn directness children reserve for people they are trying to decide whether to trust. Are these really for us? She asked. Yes, Eleanor said. The child touched the nearest book as if afraid it might vanish when claimed. Adrian watched the scene and felt again the profound rearrangement of value his life had undergone since a rain-soaked night at Vale House. Before, he had believed strength chiefly a matter of standing against the world. Eleanor had taught him that strength can also be the art of making room within it. He offered her his arm for the short walk to the ribbon table. She took it. No crowd stood ready to judge them now, only neighbors, children, servants, and spring. There are lives in which triumph arrives as spectacle. There are other lives, rarer and better, in which triumph arrives as recognition repeated daily until it becomes home. Eleanor had not changed her worth to become visible. She had simply, finally, been loved by someone honest enough to name the worth that had always been there. And somewhere in the North Country, another quiet young woman was opening her door to a rider in a groom's coat who carried a borrowed name and a future disguised as inconvenience. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.